The rain came down in icy needles the day I told them about my dream, but it wasn't the cold that stung. It was their laughter. In the back row of the campus cafeteria, where stale fries mingled with the scent of instant coffee, I stood up and said the words that had lived quietly in my chest for years. I'm going to build a company that changes everything. At first, there was silence. Just a flicker of curiosity, maybe even awe, before it was crushed under a wave of derision. Sam from marketing class spat soda through his nose as he howled with laughter, and Olivia, who'd once asked me to help, with her resume, clutched her chest like I'd told the funniest joke she'd ever heard. Even the professors, the ones who prided themselves on being vision cultivators, offered only polite, glassy-eyed nods and quickly turned to safer topics. But I wasn't surprised. I had seen the disbelief in their eyes long before I spoke. The way their pupils shrank when I walked into a room like I carried a virus called ambition. My dream wasn't about some flashy app or shallow hustle. It was about changing how people worked, how they lived, about building something so human it made the world ache in a better way. They said I was just a kid with too many TED Talks, and not enough realism. A poor excuse for a visionary in thrift store clothes and a cracked phone screen. They didn't know about the nights I'd sat in my dark room, whispering ideas to my notebook because no one else would listen. They didn't see the screenshots I saved of code errors and failure messages, each one burned into my memory as a scar I would wear like armor. They couldn't hear the tremble in my voice when I rehearsed pitches in front of a broken mirror with a hairbrush for a mic. They didn't understand how much power there was in being doubted. I went home that day feeling like I'd stood naked in a blizzard. But deep inside me, something burned. Not anger, not yet, but a fire with no name, fed by every smirk, every eye roll, every voice that told me I wasn't enough. The next morning, I woke up at 4:30 a.m. and coded until my hands cramped. I built wireframes on lunch breaks and watched UX design videos while brushing my teeth. My savings vanished, and then my credit score began to bleed, but I refused to slow down. I worked at a warehouse at night, slinging boxes heavier than my dreams just to afford one more month of server costs. There were moments, God, so many moments, when I thought they were right. Moments when the database failed, when the login screen crashed, when users signed up only to ghost my project like an empty promise. But I kept going, fueled not by hope, but by defiance. And then one night, exactly 487 days after they laughed, I saw it. A notification popped up on my phone. Congratulations, you've just made your first sale. It was a $6.99 purchase from someone named Ethan in Milwaukee. $6.99. But it felt like a cathedral bell had rung inside my chest. I held the phone to my heart and cried. Silent, messy tears for everything I'd poured into those cold, ignored hours. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I opened a bottle of warm, flat soda and toasted the ceiling like it was the sky. That was the night the noise began to change. Because soon after came the blog post, then the tweets, then the surge of downloads that turned into thousands. Suddenly, people wanted to talk. The same ones who had once asked, "Why waste your time on this?" were now asking, "Can we meet for coffee?" But coffee wasn't free anymore. Neither was my time. I didn't say that. I didn't need to. They saw it in the way my silence held more weight than their offers. They saw it in the glossy magazine spreads, in the podcast interviews where I smiled quietly as the host called me a modern-day disruptor. But I didn't care about the spotlight. I cared about the girl I used to be, the one with bloodshot eyes and chipped nails from typing too long, too hard, too late into the night. I cared about proving to her that every second of suffering had been worth it. I kept a copy of that first transaction pinned to my wall next to a photograph of the cafeteria from that day. I looked at it every morning before work, and every time I opened a new resume, yes, especially from those who once laughed, I remembered the rain, I remembered their laughter, and I smiled. It didn't happen all at once. Success never does, no matter what the headlines say. The next few months after that first sale were a mix of chaos and quiet, like living inside a thunderstorm where the eye kept moving. I spent 16 hours, a day tweaking features, answering customer emails myself, and manually fixing bugs I didn't understand how I had even written. There were days when the server collapsed under a traffic spike, and I sat on the floor with my laptop whispering desperate pleas into the keyboard like it could feel my panic. But with every crash, I got stronger. I learned to see problems as puzzles and critics as free consultants. The product evolved. What started as a rough platform became an ecosystem, something cleaner, faster, and smarter than even I had imagined. And people noticed. Investors, the same ones who once didn't return my emails, began circling like vultures suddenly turned curious doves. They threw around words like visionary, grit, and scalable like they were confetti at a party they once mocked. I didn't smile. I nodded, shook their hands, and remembered every ignored message and condescending rejection email. But I wasn't bitter. I was building. I brought on 2 developers, both self-taught and hungry like me, and paid them more than I was paying myself. I turned down 3 acquisition offers because my vision wasn't for sale. I began hiring, slowly, carefully, choosing people who believed in what we were building, not just in what they could take. That was when the first email came. Subject line: long time, no see. It was Olivia. She wrote that she'd been following my journey and was so impressed and would love to reconnect, maybe see if there's any way to collaborate. She attached her resume. I stared at it for a long time. Her credentials were good, solid internships, fluent in buzzwords, polished in all the ways I wasn't. But what I remembered wasn't her LinkedIn. It was her laugh, sharp and dismissive. Like my dream had been a fly she could swat away. I didn't delete the email, I archived it, because I knew there would be more. They trickled in at first, then poured. Hey man, I know we didn't talk much in school, but I'd love to grab a coffee. So inspired by what you've built. Do you remember me? I think we had econ together. Anyway, I'm looking for new opportunities and your company seems so aligned with my goals. Some didn't even try to pretend. I know I wasn't super supportive before, but I'd love a chance to prove myself. Each one a new variation on an old theme. We didn't believe in you, but now we want in. And each one made me pause, not to gloat, but to reflect, because I wasn't perfect. I wasn't some cold-blooded machine with a chip on my shoulder and a grudge against the world. I was still that kid who had stood in the cafeteria, voice shaking, daring to speak a dream aloud. I still remembered what it felt like to be invisible. So I read every message, every application, and I made decisions with the same fire that started it all, but also with mercy. Some I hired, not because they laughed, but because they had changed, and I believed people could. Others I politely declined, wishing them well with the same grace I had longed for once. But I never forgot. I never stopped carrying that rainy afternoon with me like a blueprint folded inside my chest. Not because I needed revenge, because it reminded me who I was and who I had refused to stop becoming. By now, we had a proper office, glass walls, big windows, and the kind of energy that crackled through every brainstorm session. My team moved like a wave, syncopated, scrappy, brilliant. And when people walked through the doors, they felt it. They didn't see a company. They saw a revolution in motion. And every so often I would walk by a meeting room and see someone interviewing for a job, someone I used to know, someone who once laughed, and I would smile, not from pride, but from the strange poetry of it all, because this wasn't about revenge. This was about transformation, about building something so alive, so undeniable, that it turned laughter into silence, and silence into awe. I had crossed the invisible line between crazy idea and industry leader. But to me, it wasn't a line at all. It was a climb. One made of sleepless nights, rejections, tiny wins, and an unshakable belief in something no one else could see. And now they saw it. Now they saw me. The office was humming like a beehive one morning when I looked out through the glass and saw him, Sam. The same Sam who once choked on laughter when I said I'd start a company, now sitting in the waiting area in a too-tight suit, clutching a folder like it held his last hope. He didn't recognize me at first when I walked past. Maybe because I wasn't the guy in second-hand sneakers anymore, or maybe because he couldn't picture me here, standing tall in the empire he once ridiculed. But I recognized the look in his eyes, that quiet, desperate hope that someone would see beyond the past and open a door. He was next in line to be interviewed by someone from HR, and I could tell he hadn't rehearsed the apology burning on his tongue. I walked past him, paused, then turned back. He looked up, blinked, and his mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Just a flush of red creeping up his neck and an awkward half-smile that begged for amnesia. I nodded, not coldly, just honestly. And I left him there not because I hated him, but because I had a meeting with a client across the world who believed in my vision without ever hearing it mocked. We closed a partnership that afternoon. That would triple our reach, a deal signed not in desperation, but in mutual admiration. When I returned to the office hours later, Sam was gone. His resume was left behind on the front desk, forgotten like a script abandoned after a failed audition. That night, I walked the halls of my own company and felt the ghosts stir, not in fear, but in reverence. I remembered when those halls were blank spreadsheets and ideas written in shaky lines on paper napkins. Now they were alive, with voices, laughter, progress, and I was no longer chasing the dream, I was protecting it. I'd started with nothing but belief, but now I had something rarer, trust. Trust from my team, from our users, from those who had once called me naive and now called me for advice. Every milestone came wrapped in irony. When Forbes asked for an interview, the journalist turned out to be someone who once ghosted me after I asked for mentorship in college. He didn't remember, but I did. I answered his questions with grace and clarity, knowing my words would echo in places I had once only dreamed of entering. When we launched our biggest feature yet, one that would revolutionize the way freelancers and small businesses collaborated, my inbox exploded with congratulations. Some were from strangers, others were from familiar names, names I'd once seen laughing at my ambition behind cold coffee cups and group chats I was never invited into. They sent me messages late at night as if distance in time would soften the embarrassment. Hey, I know this is random, but I just wanted to say I'm really proud of you. Honestly, I was wrong back then. You really proved us all wrong. And sometimes, the most honest of all, I'm sorry. Some of them I responded to. Some I let float away, like paper boats in a river that no longer ran near me, because my life wasn't built to prove them wrong. It was built to prove me right. My team grew from 2 to 20, then from 20 to over 100. I hired artists, coders, dreamers, and believers, people who had been underestimated like I once was. We had no dress code, no time clocks, just a shared fire to build something breathtaking. We turned conference rooms into creative labs and lunch breaks into mentorship circles. I made it a rule. No one gets laughed out of this building for dreaming, because that's how it should have been from the start. We hosted our first conference in a hall that used to feel too big for our budget. Now it was packed wall to wall with people who wanted to hear how we did it. As I stood backstage before my keynote, I scrolled through an old photo I kept on my phone. Me in that cafeteria, surrounded by smirking faces, my hand raised, my mouth open mid-sentence. No one remembered that moment but me, but it had birthed everything. I walked out onto the stage, the lights hot on my face, and looked out at the crowd. Thousands of eyes looked back, not with doubt, but with hunger. Hunger to believe, to build, to become. And in that moment, I knew. This was more than a company. It was a lighthouse for the ones still standing in the storm, still being laughed at, still clinging to their fragile dreams in a world that feeds on doubt. And I would keep that light burning for as long as it took, because I remembered what it felt like to walk in darkness. I remembered how powerful it was to hear, "I believe you." And I would say it now to every forgotten genius, every silenced soul, every person laughed at until they whispered instead of spoke. The night before our company's 3rd anniversary, I stayed late in the office alone. The building was quiet except for the gentle hum of the servers, a sound that had become sacred to me, the rhythm of something I built breathing through electricity and code. I stood by the wide windows that overlooked the city and watched the lights flicker across buildings I used to pass on the bus while wondering if I'd ever matter. I ran my fingers along the conference table, now etched with tiny scratches. From 1,000 brainstorms, 100 deals, and more than a few tears. I remembered sitting on milk crates in my apartment, designing the first logo with a friend who now ran his own startup, because that's what dreams do when they're honored. They multiply. We had just crossed our 1,000,000th user, not downloads, active users. People whose lives were made better, easier, or more possible because I had once refused to shut up when the world told me to. The media called us a unicorn, a term that once felt mythical, now tattooed onto articles, headlines, hashtags. But what they didn't see, what they could never know, was the cost behind the miracle. The months I couldn't afford heat. The day I sold my last guitar to keep our database online. The morning I almost gave up because my bank account had gone negative and all I had left was belief. They didn't see my mother crying quietly at the kitchen table because she wanted to help, but had nothing to give but faith. They didn't hear the late-night phone calls from my best friend, who said, "You don't have to be great, you just have to keep going." They didn't witness the way I whispered affirmations into the dark, my voice the only candle in the void. But I remembered every one of those moments. I held them like prayer beads, not in bitterness, but in reverence, because they made the light shine brighter now. And then, as if fate had a sense of theater, I got the message. From the last person I ever expected, a professor, the one who had once told me, "Not everyone is meant to be a leader. Some of us are meant to follow." She was retiring now, apparently. She said she'd been following my story and wanted to know if I could speak at the university. She said she believed her students would benefit from my journey. I read the email 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to feel how far I had come. I stared at the screen for a long time, thinking about the boy I used to be, the one who walked out of her class with his head down, dreams bleeding in his chest. And then I typed, "I'd be honored," because this wasn't about vindication. This was about becoming the person I needed when I was invisible. So I stood on that same stage weeks later, in the same lecture hall, facing new faces with familiar, fire in their eyes. And I told them the truth. I told them that laughter doesn't kill dreams, but silence can. That doubt is a chorus you'll always hear, but it doesn't have to be your soundtrack. I told them about the nights I wept, the mornings I rose, the people who didn't believe, and the few who did. I told them, "You are allowed to want more. You are allowed to build it yourself." And when I finished, they stood. Not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because they saw themselves in my story. The same way I once searched for myself in someone else's. When I returned to the office that evening, my team had filled the main room with candles, one for every milestone we'd crossed. 100 small flames flickered across the glass like stars that refused to burn out. They stood around me, clapping, laughing, not at me, but with me. And then one of them handed me a notebook. Old, worn, familiar. My first journal. They had found it in a box I kept in storage, scanned every page, and printed the dreams I'd written all those years ago. Inside the cover, in my messy handwriting, were the words, "They won't believe me. I'll build it anyway." And I did. I built it. On bones and belief. On doubt and defiance. On love and loneliness. And now, the same ones who once laughed, stood outside, resumes in hand, knocking at the gates of the world they once said I'd never build. Some of them I welcomed. Some of them I watched walk away. But all of them became part of the proof that a dream, when held long enough, becomes reality. That belief, when protected fiercely enough, becomes legacy. And that laughter fades, but vision echoes forever.